born in 1940, so we're talking 1945. Now, I tended to read a lot of this stuff and retain it to a certain extent, so that whatever books, and basically probably Ellsworth Jaeger was a big one, because they had about 4 or 5 books, and he had picked up the notion that outdoor people are very visual. So one page is diagrams, the other page is text, usually. You never saw 2 pages, I think, that were text facing each other, which is something that I think was, people like to see certain things. It's easier to visualize. As a matter of fact, there probably was about 20, 30 books that I was familiar with. I could talk to you, and I'd know what books you had by what you said, because things were pretty well specific. Well, I had a kind of an interesting event when I met this fellow named Tom Roycroft. It was sort of like the beginning of a long string of people that actually, it was like something that I bounced off of them, and if they weren't there to bounce off, I was just going at a site that I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, might say. So there's a big handful, like Dave, where basically running into them, it was always something very positive that happened, and I happened to be at the right place at the right time. Now this Tom Roycroft fellow, he was a civilian instructor, and I was intrigued with this idea of survival. When I was growing up, that was very rare, the word survival. And I happened to drive by the school on a regular basis. I was a welfare officer on my way to one community. And being intrigued, I looked him up, and as I talked to him, I said, "Where does this guy come from? I can't place anything he says," which was sort of an unusual experience, because basically what you know is what you learn from others, and pretty soon you adopt that, and if you happen to say what in that book, right away people recognize where you got it, that sort of thing. I recognized, well, he was very self-taught. As he started working at a survival school as a civilian instructor, and basically didn't seem to know how to get a hold of all the traditional books. So everything was more or less now hinged on his guru, who was an old trapper. And between that and that became a refreshing perspective on stuff, and I think that influenced northern bushcraft a great deal, sort of thing. And I tell this, people almost think it's a joke, but what caught my eye, well, first I got involved with scouting materials. The school, a country school, happened to have a scout troop many years before. We're talking, let's say, 1947 or something. We, 3 of us in the same grade, discovered this barrel full of scouting pamphlets, materials. There was no manuals, but there was almost every thing, like how to build a walking staff. There was one article. Mors Kochanski was another, semaphore was another, and so on. And the 3 of us virtually became a scout troop in ourselves. And when we tried to buy the scout uniforms, they wouldn't sell us because we couldn't prove that we were Boy Scouts. But we were probably way more knowledgeable than almost every average city Boy Scout, because later when I joined a scout troop in the city of Prince Albert, they bored me to death. They were playing games, and I'm looking. Well, I'm a kid in grade 9. I own my own tractor. I've been shooting crows since I was in grade 6. I have my own horse. I mean, I was in the kids' league, whereas I was already a small grown man from the farm experience. You're always busy and that sort of thing. But anyway, I was very intrigued with scouting stuff, and I started to seek out scouting manuals. And there are many that are actually very good. But my idea was that I wanted to write a manual for adults. I wanted to make sure that this was a reference for explorers. And I had no knowledge about the gazillion books that we have there, that sort of thing. And in truth, one thing that caught my eye was I shouldn't maybe, because it doesn't contribute to my mystique so much. But Huey, Louie, and Dewey, Donald Duck's nephews, when they would go camping, every time they ran into a problem, they referred to the woodchuck manual. Well, for a while, I thought the woodchuck manual, maybe Disney produced the woodchuck manual, and I could order it. So I attempted to find the manual, because from the what I read about his nephews going camping, a lot of these sort of the questions came up. I said, boy, that's a legitimate concern. So they would read the book and solve the problem. And eventually I realized that there wasn't a woodchuck manual. I said, I'm going to write it. So that's the woodchuck manual that we're talking about there, where I started to try to collect stuff that was organized in a way where, you know, you based on, you know, almost anthropological seriousness, because I thought it might be useful to be sure that you understand where things come from and whatever. Well, as time goes on, people often keep asking me, where do you come from? And I have a lot of fun by bad-mouthing Raymond Mears. He's the celebrity in the UK. And I say, this is not the way Raymond Mears would do it, sort of thing. So I reflected to see what his background might be. Well, I was born to a Polish family that could hardly speak English. My parents were forest people. They related to the forest. They came from Poland in 1938, and when I was already maybe 4, I am gathering the mushrooms, they tell me. The knowledge they had on mushrooms they brought from Poland, and we used a lot of mushrooms. When they were in season, they were dried in great quantities. My mother would disappear for, a week, maybe sometimes 2 weeks, and this is something you remember a long time because you don't often find a situation when your mother is gone for such a long time, and she's off with a bunch of other Polish women with horse and wagon, traveling probably a day, almost a day or two, to the prime blueberry country, and they all come back when they can't get any more blueberries in that wagon, because there's got to be room for them. They take hay and canvas, and they sleep on the hay in the wagon boxes, and they pull the canvas in case it rains. And the butter boxes that were used to ship butter, they're made out of wood, and they've got these very strong corners, and these were the favorite boxes to fill to the top with blueberries. And my mother would probably come home with half a dozen or whatever, a lot of blueberries, and then subsequently began to can them. My father would go fishing, fill barrels, snow jackfish till they're full, and we ate those fish and on and on. My father was a logger in the winter. He was a carpenter in the summer. So there was an awful lot of logging going on, and every carpentry tool you can imagine, they're my toys, you might say. So I say, well, that's probably the sort of thing. I have an older brother, 8 years older. He becomes an orthopedic surgeon. He comes home on weekends. He has to room and board because 10 miles away is the high school, and horse and wagon, there's no way you can commute. And like today, you commute 50, 60 miles to go to school. And so he has to room and board, but he comes home, and in order to have more spending money, he has a trap line, and he shoots squirrels in season. And he sends away all these furs and pelts. And personally, myself, I've never sent a single pelt to that, but I fixated on that sort of thing. He wore the big hunting knife on his belt, and he was a crack shot with a 22. And as a little kid, I sort of thought, hey, my brother's kind of a skilled person in these sort of things. But we didn't really do that much, like in camping or that sort of stuff, without that being the issue. So I had to help skin, and I turned the crank when he sharpened his knife on the big stone wheel, and on and on and on. So the background that comes up isn't one by accident. It's the that sort of thing. The next thing that comes on the situation is realizing that I had to learn how to write, and then I focused on that as a hobby, so that I could write clearly, and I read lots. I might claim to have invented a half dozen things, you might say, by the fact that I would see relationships and I'd put them together and I would come up with something kind of different from one end or the other. The igloo, for example. You can't build igloos generally where I lived. We found that you could pack the snow, and if you knew what you're doing, you could build igloos. And only once in a blue moon would the storm settle snow, so you could build villages of igloos because the snow was primed for igloo construction. But as I studied the igloo to write an article, I said, what if I tried to imitate all the same properties of that igloo, but in non-snow? And so comes the thing called the super shelter, which means that we have to sort of understand the physics behind what makes an igloo work, the ingenuity of the Inuit in their being able to come up with all that sort of thing, and on and on. And then, lo and behold, if you keep track of the science, a lot of that stuff works to the extent that you make unusual progress. Because generally what you find, most people, well, what are the gripes? People don't verify a lot of things. They accept things and assume, and after a while you begin to, that a lot of stuff can be a figment of somebody's imagination. And the gripes that I would have with the fellow professors in outdoor ed is they didn't do very much innovative work, they didn't do very much trying to update stuff, they didn't do very much to support what they thought they knew by anthropological studies, etc. So that's where I sort of got in. And never really could get too deep a foothold because I never got a degree. So, and that stood me in such good stead because a lot of people would say you're lucky you don't have a degree because you can say anything you like. Well, the situation that I would get into is that very often I would come up with something and I had absolutely no idea if I would be right. But I would say, I will put it out and let them change it if it's wrong. And if they can't change it, it's going to stay. And so you got to be careful. You can perpetrate all kinds of misinformation if you're careless. And anyway, I don't know if this is where we find it useful, the direction I'm going here. I asked Dave to always keep me on track. Anyway, so in the situation, now here's the funny thing, really. If the publisher of Bushcraft did not corner me and committed me to write it, I do honestly believe I still would not have written Bushcraft. I never chose that title. He throws Richard Graves' book from Australia. He says, can you write a book like this, but for the Northern Hemisphere? That's why we called it Northern Bushcraft. Then when he passes on, his son doesn't seem to, there's a disconnect, they drop the word Northern. Not a good thing for me, because, I said, why did you do this? And they didn't have the common courtesy to discuss it with me. Well, Calgarians, they see themselves as Southerners, and we don't sell very many books in Calgary. And I said, yeah, but the Northern, the Americans on the Canadian border see themselves as Northerners. There's a lot more of them wanting to buy the book, and on and on. So my royalties actually, dropped, from about 8,000 to 2,000 just because they dropped Northern. And then it took about 5 years to get back up to where it should be, sort of thing. But anyway, it's an interesting thing. Now when I encountered Larry Dean Olson's book, shortly after I think he published it, I actually wrote him, but he didn't answer my letter. I was a probation officer for juvenile delinquents, and he was in this program, I think, with the Anasazi program or whatever. I heard about it, so I wrote him, and I said, I'm sorry it is, but he must have been too busy, so he never answered. But I found his book to be marvelous because it preceded Bushcraft considerably. And if you know where to look, you'll see where I cribbed stuff from his book, because I sort of thought, if you study a book and find what I feel is the best stuff they have, find a way to steal it. And then you put together the best of many other people, but do it so they can hardly recognize it, and that works well. It's a sort of a thing. I don't invent very many things. I have to discover. Now, the other thing that I should say, I always look on the situation that I'll pick up a book, and there's a plethora of books on survival and so on. And I look at the person and I say, no diagrams, blah, blah. The difference between me and many writers is that I was tried and tested through instructorship. So that everything I did, if I presented it to a bunch of university students, I spent 22 years teaching for the university, and then I worked 17 years in the in the schools, in schools in British Columbia. And whenever you've got 30 people, you should realize there is a number of those people that whatever topic you choose, there's likely a number of people who are more knowledgeable in that topic. And you have to develop a very graceful reaction that when they say something you recognize is better than yours, to turn it around for the benefit of the students and to pick their brains. They haven't written this down. A lot of Northern Bushcraft is probably other people who said really good things that I dumped onto them, and they only said a little bit, but I gathered those little bits, and it got into the text. I taught survival for 10 years and I couldn't sharpen a knife until one of the students showed up. And when he threw his knife, and I said, man, I can hardly cut it, I need to sharpen it. He said, try mine. Well, I almost fainted when I took that knife and realized, this is sharp. So I picked his brains. Well, the whole process went on for years and years, where whenever I encountered somebody who seemed to know more than me, then I wasn't going to progress unless I picked their brains. And they were my instructors, not going to a college or going to places where I find somebody who's supposed to know. I became that type of person. When people come to me, and I'm supposed to teach you how to sharpen and how to walk and how to chop and how to do a lot of things, that sort of thing. So that's what reflects in the thing. It's not an accident. The book it took sort of aggressive accumulation of knowledge, and I happen to be fortunate to have to be sort of close to the mark in many respects. And generally, whenever I wanted to write a chapter, I almost had to write the book because there was no book for me to steal from. So I wanted to write a book, for example, that's still out there. It's a chapter in a book that was called Clothing and Survival. There's so few books. The field is absolutely wide open on clothing. You know, the physics of clothing and the physiology of the human body that requires clothing. So I had to write the book to extract the information to make a compact chapter in any book. In that process, sort of thing. But being tried and tested by students, so you make a presentation. And there's all kinds of questions for clarification. Take that into account. The next presentation, deal with that. Pretty soon you make a presentation and there's no questions for clarification. That's probably the time you should write the chapter. So when people are taking furious notes and you're on and you say, what are you doing? I'm writing a book. No, I don't think you're going to get very far that way. You've got to have another more dynamic process. You've got to sort of into that. And you've got to be careful. Now, when you're a survival instructor, what you have to worry about is that the student who learns from you doesn't have good cause to curse you because the things you taught them don't work or obviously are deficient in some way. That's a problem that you've got to think about because there could be a lot of students who are former students who don't like what you've been doing because it doesn't work for them or whatever that issue. You always got to keep in mind how much they can absorb and what it is that's essential. You know, you meet a group of, I work with teachers a great deal, teaching teachers how to teach out their ed. Knowing human nature, I will come on the scene and I'll say, what do you guys want to know? And they'll tell me for a while. And when we exhaust it, then I'll say, now I'm going to teach you what you need to know. I get fairly arrogant because in my professional, I know what they should know. But unless I dissipate what they feel they want to know, and that plays a role almost all the time, then after that you start rolling and you got that out of the way, they're happy. And now you're starting to say, well, this is what we find that you better know because that's important. You know, go to an old Indian, an old native person, and he's 80 years old, and you go up to him and say, how do you survive in the forest? And the old Indian goes, well, you know, the first thing you better do is learn how to dress properly. And after you really learn dress, how to do this, the next thing you got to learn is how to light fire. Oh, they have no idea what they should tell you first. They live it. And when you ask them to start something, they don't know where to start because to them everything is sort of in a dynamic situation. But if you work at it and you go to that old native person and you say, I've been working on this problem and I just can't get past this point, how would you do that? And they have the answer. But if you ask them to teach you or take you under their wing, that's not their way of doing it. It just doesn't go anywhere. And if you're fortunate, that's another thing, is fortunate that being a welfare officer, for example, I exploited to the maximum my relationship with the Aboriginal people in my district. Because I would show up there and I would talk about old days and how they did things. That the welfare aspect I just totally ignored. I say, what do you need? And I write off the chits and everything. And then I say, what do you need? Eventually they wanted me as their worker because I never gave them a hard time about that. And we like to talk. And they were obligated to answer my questions. There is a bit of, and there was astounding amount of little pointers that you end up finding that gain the clarification. Because, I always felt that the native people knew how to live in the bush. They didn't know how to survive in the bush.